Hey guys, welcome back to the Carrot Poker School. This is the final lecture before the exam of grade 2. Welcome to lecture 10. And in today's class, we're going to be discussing raising. We're going to be talking about a few different types of post-flop raising today. Firstly, facing c-bets and facing range bets. We'll then move on to thinking about how to raise on the turn when we face a double barrel. And then finally, facing river bets, mainly focusing on smaller river bets and how to construct a raising range against them. To begin with, let's just recap by saying that the more merged villain c-bet range, that's to say the less definition and polarization to villain c-bet range, the more raises we want to play in general. This means that we can raise thinner for value because villain themselves is betting a thinner value range with more medium strength hands and will thus have to defend more medium strength hands. And given that we will be value raising wider, we'll also be able to bluff with more combinations in order to create some indifference for our opponent, which is always our goal in GTO. In this situation, we face a range bet from the button, and we decide to raise 4x on ace-8-4. What I'd like you to think about here is, of the following hands, what do you think their raise frequencies are going to be? In other words, how often are each of the following hands going to make this play? First off, pocket fours. How often do you think this one will be raising? 6-5 suited, ace-8 of diamonds, jack-10 clubs, and finally, ace-9 of spades. This is the ideal opportunity for you to pause the video, have an attempt at this exercise, and then we'll see how you did. Assuming that you're ready for the answers, I'll start by saying that one of the most important features of this situation is that villain is betting range. We are deliberately focusing heavily on facing range bets on favourable textures for the preflop raiser's range such as this one, because it's a bit of a more pertinent thing to do given how the practical reality of cash game poker is these days. Many training programs, coaches, etc. are encouraging their students to bet range to simplify on many textures where a solver would maybe just bet between 50 and 70% of the time. While such a strategy doesn't incur a big EV loss for the c-better, we need to know how to play against it as the big blind because our strategy is going to shift a lot. What this means is that you probably underestimated the amount of raising that all of these hands do. Pocket fours is a hand that when you're against a very merged range, you need to understand that turn is going to check through more frequently than if you're against a more polarized range. Villain is going to have much more of those tier 4 medium holdings in their range and therefore aggressing immediately with a hand that unblocks not just ace-x and 8x, but also some combinations that are more mergy like kings, queens, jacks, 10s, 9s, 7s, 4x, etc. that have to bet call. Obviously we block the 4, but we unblock all of the other ones. This means that we want to fast play our hand. Had villain potted it here, overbet, or we just happen to know that this player was only betting ace-x and bluffs, then we could probably slow play this hand because the amount of turn aggression we're going to face would compensate for money not earned by raising flop immediately and not building that pot towards its crucial investment ceiling. But given that villain will not be betting turn at a really high frequency theoretically here, we're going to want to raise immediately with a hand with these unblockers. So pocket fours is an example of a holding that's not really negotiable. If you decide to slow play here, you will actually be forfeiting around 20 to 30% of the pot. The solver thinks that our EV pot entitlement here is 183% pot with a raise and just 159% pot with a call. That's a really big swing. And we need to make sure that we're not tossing away that number of BB per 100 in our win rate by doing that. Obviously, we can't literally derive the BB per 100 from this, but this sort of mistake will impact our win rate long term for sure. The reason we can't derive the BB per 100 of such a mistake is that you don't play this spot 100 times in 100 hands. So it's a bit of a fallacy that you can just take the numbers here and multiply them or whatever. Nevertheless, though, it's a big mistake. A hand that's not quite as big a mistake to call with here is 6-5 of hearts. However, the solver thinks that due to the frailty of this hand, the fact that our opponent is just betting so frequently, that it's actually necessary to raise here. This hand is not super frail, like it can continue by calling. It would be really frail if it was facing a turn bet and it would struggle to be able to call, given that it would have to just check on the river, not building a donking range there for our range in most situations. At this point in the hand, it's not absurd to call because you're going to have that river bluff opportunity, but the problem is rather that the hand is combining a mix of nut potential, unblockers to a folding range, and being semi-frail, that it just wants to raise immediately. All three of those factors make raising better than calling. Let's start by unpacking them one by one. Firstly, I mentioned that this hand was semi-frail. That just means that on many runouts it will not be in a very good spot on the turn if it faces a bet. Fortunately, as I said, We won't face a bet all the time or even close to that, but on a turn like a queen, when we check 6-5 and face a bet, we're left with a slightly profitable check raise perhaps or a fold, we can't call, and our EV is plummeted towards 0. I also mentioned that this hand had great nut potential. When villain is going to be more merged, you don't get as much EV when you turn the nuts by checking as you would against the more polar range. You just face aggression less often. Therefore, it behooves us to try to drive the action a little bit more ourselves here in case the turn is a 7, and that's not a sufficient reason for raising. Never want to cite, I'm going to raise in case the turn is a 7 as a reason for raising. It's a sweetener, it's a cherry on top, it's not actually the cake itself. And then thirdly, I mentioned the fact that this hand unblocks a folding range. The reason for that is that villain doesn't have a load of cards around the 6 and the 5 here. Combinatorically pre-flop, when they open the button, they're going to mainly have bigger offsuit cards rather than smaller offsuit cards. Offsuit cards are, as we know, much more combinatorically relevant than suited ones. There are 3 times as many combinations. Therefore, when villain is just betting with air here and is going to be folding, there'll be a big density in hands like Jack 10 off, Jack 9 off, Queen 9 off, King 7 off, things like this that are going to be folding. But we won't see hands like Queen 6, King 5 offsuit opening from this position. So the 6 and the 5 are going to unblock that bet and then fold range, while actually blocking a few continues like Ace 6, Ace 5, 5, 4, 6, 4, 8, 6, 8, 5, etc. Even pocket 6s and 5s are going to be calls to a raise here because this is just such a wide range spot where button has not filtered their range at all. The more of your range that you bet as a c-better on the flop, the more speculative looking the hands will be that game theory forces you to defend to a raise. With ace 8 of diamonds, it's the same thing. You might look at this and think, but now we're blocking an ace or an 8. Well, I'll start off by saying that blocking an ace is not actually that clear an indication that we want to slow play our hand. The reason for that is that an ace is not really the sort of hand that invests only passively. An ace invests aggressively as well. So when you call, the fact that you block an ace means that you will actually face less turn bets than average, and you won't be able to check raises frequently. What this means is that raising immediately could be an okay idea. When you block an 8, that is a slight factor in favour of slow playing, because a lot of villain's bet call range on the flop here is going to be 8x. However, ranges are so wide, and villain has bet everything, and we can safely say that the 8 is not a huge part of his range in such a composition. There are going to be many other hands bet calling here, like gut shots, pocket pairs, etc. So ace 8, against the merge range that's betting everything, is still going to be at high urgency and is still going to be a pure raise according to the solver. You'll note that the EV loss from raising this hand with these different blockers and slightly less nutted equity is going to be less than that of failing to raise pocket 4s, but still all 3 of these hands so far are very mandatory to raise, for different reasons. Jack 10 of clubs, you look at this hand and you think, well, what's this? It's jack high, it's got some backdoor draws, do I really want to be raising? Would I not rather have a gut shot? Well, we know by now to reject this we have better bluffs fallacy, an absolute garbage thought process that's everywhere in the poker world, which is great for us because our opponents are succumbing to this pitfall, but we're going to avoid it and we're going to understand that our range, as we'll see later today, is going to crave a mixture of different types of bluff. It's going to want some more direct draws that are higher EV, like 6-5, but it's also going to want some of these more flimsy draws, whose EV, as you can see, is much closer to 0. Jack 10 of clubs coming in here at 3.73 or 3.64% pot. Regardless of what you do, it's fairly close, but the solver does have a slight preference for raising. This one I wouldn't bite your head off if you called here. The pair draws are a bit better. You're blocking a few more folds by blocking offsuit club X combos that exist as broadways, so it's not as clear a raise as 6-5, but it's still a very good raise and you want to be filling your range up with lots of these as well. Another reason why your range is raising so often on this node, I think it'll be about 22%, something like this, maybe a bit less, maybe like 18, 19, but certainly a high raise frequency for range. The reason for this is that relative polarization is actually more towards us. Villain is more emerged through having more combos of king, queen, king, jack, kings, queens, jacks, 10s, 9s. These are unique combos to button. Big blind does not have these at all really. There's a little bit of king, jack off, sure, but not a lot of the other ones, and therefore has less mediocre hands. Clark's theorem basically says do a lot of raising when your range contains way less mediocre hands than your opponent's range. Ace 9 is the only hand that is callable of these 5 according to this sim, though as I mentioned I don't mind calling Jack 10 of clubs. This hand is also important to raise with sometimes. If you don't raise with this hand, but you play the rest of the strategy the same way, what happens is that you end up insanely overbluffing. This isn't bad in a vacuum, and if you're against an unknown player it doesn't really matter. If you're in a low visibility pool like an anonymous pool, or you're just at the casino one night playing a cash game, it probably doesn't matter if you forgo this raise. But long term, against tough opposition in a higher visibility game, you need to be raising some of this top pair. Of course it helps and it hinders to have a backdoor. It helps because you have more equity and you can outdraw stuff when you're behind, but it hinders because it actually blocks some of villain's continues. Possibly villain gets to call some backdoor flush draws here, though I don't think one's pertaining to the 9. So this is probably a good hand to raise. It'd be interesting that if you had a slightly different situation where you had a pair with an offsuit card, you'd actually want to raise more when you had the diamond in your hand and spade, heart or club, because you'd want villain to call you with a backdoor flush draw. As you can see, on this texture, which is quote unquote a good board for buttons range, we do a lot of raising. Is this a contradiction? No, because raising is about polarization. Raising is a large investment as opposed to a small one. It's not no investment compared with a small one, or investing as opposed to not. Raising here has to adhere to the laws of Clark's theorem and not range favorability. It doesn't matter if I have a ton of awful hands in my range. That doesn't stop me raising the top of it, and it doesn't stop me finding some high EV and low EV bluffs. Yes, I'm going to be overfolding to a C-bet here relative to the pot odds norm, and that's correct theoretically. And yes, I'm going to have way too many combos of Jack-9 offsuit that just have to go away, but that has absolutely nothing to do with how often I raise. How often I raise is down to how polarized my range is and how many value hands I have, and given that the ace is insanely polarizing to the big blind player, they will actually be raising more on ace-high boards than on some other flop textures, but it will depend. When there's a second Broadway, that's going to change a little bit, but ace-8-4 is a classic high-frequency raise board, as is something like ace-7. So semi-polarized raising ranges. That's what we just looked at. We're not completely polar here, we're semi-polarized. Let's see how that looks. What I've done here is just isolated the hands that we're raising and displayed them based on their equity, not EV. As you can see, 8s only has 95%, so that has to be equity. The hand is entitled to 200% pot, probably something like that. And as we can see here, it's not all green and orange. Orange hands are obviously lower EV, green ones are higher EV. Then we have some mediocre hands going on here as well. We have some hands like 8-7, 8-6, 8-5. You may well remember the concept of hybrids from lecture 6 of this grade, and that's very much what's going on there. The semi-polarized raising range is a range that raises mainly strong value hands as its value region, and bluffs of course, high EV and low EV bluffs, but also some hybrid hands. Hybrid hands will get a boost from all 3 taps in the betting sink. The hybrid part is usually made up of vulnerable pairs on the board, because these are the hands that gain the most useful fold equity and turn on the denial tap the most to fill the sink up to the can bet, or can raise in this case, line. Our bluffs here are going to range from fairly low EV hands like 7-5 suited, to very low EV hands like 10-9 suited. We could talk here about high EV bluffs and low EV bluffs, but we have to understand that this is a relative comparison, and in that context 7-5 would be high EV and 10-9 would be low EV, even though the EV or equity of 7-5, well, the equity is 30%, the EV is going to be not very much because you're going to have to invest more money, so it's going to be close to sort of 15-20% pot, I would think, in EV, but that's much higher than the EV of raising some backdoor like 10-9 of hearts, which is going to be close to 0. As long as it's not 0, our raise is better than break even. It could also be the case that we can call some of these hands. On other textures where things are wetter, and there are flush draws and open-end straight draws and combo draws present, you'll often hear people referring to semi-bluffing. I want to semi-bluff this draw in this spot. Bluff is a bit of a weird word to use there. Sure, bluff usually means I'm pretending I have a good hand and making you fold a better one type thing in the absolute sort of caveman sense of the word. I don't think when you have a flush draw that it's false to say that you have a good hand, so you can't pretend to have a good hand when you do have a good hand. A flush draw has EV of 80%, 90% pot, stuff like that based on the combination of its equity implied odds and fold equity. We have another term for this as we'll see. Another way to get a sense of how the EV of raising a hand compares to calling is to use the EV comparison tool that we're going to look at in Pio Solver here. But first, let's just map out this range, do a bit of range geography. So as we can see, the bottom of our value range is around ace-9, ace-10, that sort of thing. With the suited cards, ace-6, ace-7 are not ridiculous to raise, but they generally don't. But I've covered them up here. Ace-9 is the last bastion of raising for value. Then we have some other regions like hybrids, 8-5. Note that the 8x that tends to raise here is going to be almost exclusively 8x where the kicker is low. And if you imagine that villain has a hand here like King Jack, you now have much more useful fold equity because 8-5 is always going to suffer that 2 overcard threat from King Jack. But when you have King 8, King Jack is heavily dominated and needs to spike a jack. If King Jack hits a king, you're actually really happy about that because when turn goes check check, remember villain should check back a king on the turn, we can then bet the river and get called a lot. So actually the king is a good card for us to see when we have king 8, but a bad card when we have 8-5. The same can't be really said about the 5, because it's very infrequently that villain is going to pair the 5 and then pay off bets. He's just not going to pair the 5 much to begin with. It's not a card that's prevalent in their range, and so there's a big distinction here. The fold equity is much more useful when we have the low kicker to go with that pair on the board than when we have a higher one. Then we have low EV bluffs, and I mean this in the absolute sense, that the hands don't have a lot of EV, like gut shots with backdoors being the highest EV ones. Then we have even lower EV bluffs. I don't mind you saying high and low here, I don't mind you saying low and lower, as long as you strike a comparison between a hand that's just flimsy backdoors, like 10-6 suited, and an immediate straight draw like 7-6. So we saw already how the calling median was this large tier 4 sort of region of our range that forced us to invest passively or check, and this exists here too. So there are certain hands that would be huge blunders to raise on the flop, and there are certain hands that would be huge blunders to call. What we're seeing here is a map of how strongly the solver prefers one line to another with certain hands. Where we have a strong green color, the solver is saying you have to call here, and if you raise, it's actually a really big mistake. And where you see a bright pink color, you're seeing the opposite. You have to raise, calling would be a big blunder. Where it's white, the solver is saying that there's no difference between call and raise. The solver is not comparing fold here with any hand. Therefore, when you see a hand like 9-7 of diamonds here appear white, that simply means that you need to fold that hand, and calling and raising are not too different. In fact, with 9-7 of diamonds, calling is a bit better because raising is just so awful. You don't want to raise trash because the idea is that you have a range disadvantage here, so you have to be selective about what you bluff. You're in an unfavorable world for range, at least until you've filtered. So hands like king, queen, king, jack, 9s and 7s constitute the calling median. They are the tier 4 of the facing a bet world. And note that we don't really use the tier system when we're facing a bet, because it's not really relevant whether we have tier 2, tier 3 or tier 4 sometimes. It's more relevant what kind of bluff catcher we have, or whether we can chop or beat some value hands, or whether we may lose to some bluffs. Hands in our calling median when we're facing a bet will usually have the following properties that can help us to identify these hands. They will not benefit as much from protection as other mediocre hands. Compare king queen here, which has 2 of the common danglers. I want to use the word danglers here and just maybe give you a brief explanation about what it means. A dangler is an unpaired hole card, which commonly would hit a pre-flop opening range or calling range. So when you have king queen here, you have 2 cards that villain will very often share with you, and if they come out on the turn, that's actually good for you. So you don't need as much denial when you have king queen. You just want to call. Well, one, you're just like way too far into the middle of your range to consider raising for either purpose, but secondly, the fold equity is just not as useful as normal, because villain isn't folding 5-6, 7-6, ace-x, 8x, 4x, nothing like that. The villain is folding king 10, and you dominate king 10, so that fold equity is fairly useless on a regular basis when you have king queen. Secondly, these green shaded hands here, the calling median hands, are better to call than to fold due to robustness properties, not frail ones. So the thing that makes these hands continuable is not really to do with redraw, although of course redraw always helps to some extent for any hand that's live against a value bet. So for example, king jack though, it's not calling just to try and spike second pair. Yes, that's nice when you do that, it does give you higher pot share than when you miss, but the thing with king jack is it's just brute force showdown value. And as we noted previously, villain having bet all of a really wide opening range is going to have to slow down the turn pretty frequently after we filter and their equity advantage dissipates. King queen, king jack, king 10 are calling for showdown value reasons. You can't realize all of that equity, but you can realize enough of it that you can call a small bet. We're facing B33 here, remember. Thirdly, these calling median hands rarely improve to very strong holdings. Therefore, they avoid big pots. Contrast this to 7-6 of spades, which is a mandatory raise here against a range bet. This hand likes big pots, firstly because it doesn't have any showdown value to be ruined by bloating the pot anyway. You can't really go wrong by bloating the pot with 7 high. Bluffing 7 high all in on the river is rarely going to be a big mistake, but going crazy with king jack here is, because you're sacrificing something that was already quite good if you just chose a more passive route in hand. The thing with 7-6 is that the passive route isn't that good anyway. Overall, these calling median hands have a very distinct set of properties, and if you remember these, you will avoid making the dreaded polarization error in spots like this. Now a bit more about these bizarre hybrid hands, which are close in EV between calling and raising. So here is our opponent's reaction to a flop raise. Oftentimes, in order to understand why we play a certain way, it can be beneficial or even necessary to look at the spot from villain's point of view. go into the future, and then come back to the present. By seeing what would happen theoretically if you take a certain action, you can improve your understanding of the properties of that action and how good a choice it would be. In this case, we can see that Button has to defend a lot. Hands that look extremely dubious, like King Queen and King Jack suited, are peeling here with backdoors. You can see that Villain's main folding cards are the King, the Queen, the Jack, the 10, and the 9. These are the cards that we expect to have a lower EV by bluffing on the flop, partially for this reason and partially because they don't have straight draws. The amount of 3-betting that's going on here is absolutely negligible, and in reality, a strong player will probably just never 3-bet you in this spot on the flop, and that's fine. That's another reason why you can reopen action a lot more here and raise. If you are playing against a recreational player that will 3-bet ace-king on the flop here all the time just for the hell of it, you want to be a bit more careful about what you raise probably, but that's another story. So as we can see, the fold equity we get when we raise these low pairs is mainly very useful because the cards that fold are these 2 big cards. So to understand why it's okay, in other words, why there is no EV loss between raising and calling with hands like the following, we need to understand this reaction. As big blind now, when we have 5-4, we can raise because the betting sink is actually in our favor. All 3 parts of it are doing something here. At least value and denial are. Maybe we can't really call this much of a bluff, but deuces we can even say there's a shred of bluff going on here because they fold 3s sometimes. We have to understand that for hands like 5-4 suited, this ability to win a large pot when we hit one of the 5 pair outs, not to mention the backdoor straight, is part of the value raise itself. That's part of your equity. It's just that the equity realization for a hand like 5-4 is incredibly polarized, whereas the equity realization for a hand like King Queen is incredibly flat, linear, merged, you could even say. With King Queen, it's very steady. You just hit a king or you hit a queen, that's the spike, it's not that good, or nothing happens and you win with king high or you don't. It's very flat. With 5-4, it's a bit less flat than that because there are now some branches of the tree where you have trips or 2 pair or a straight, and when you have those hands, you can play a very big pot. You realize a ton of equity all of a sudden on rare cases. You can't do that with King Queen. With a hand like deuces, it's also quite flat that you have showdown value, but there's now 2 outs to hit something absolutely incredible, which is a set. 4th set here is a huge hand. And if you had a gut shot, it'd be more polarized still. You had a hand like 5-6 here, you end up with 6 high or a straight on the river. Maybe you have a pair sometimes, but usually it's going to just be air. So I guess you could say that the more polarized the equity realization is here, the more raising you can do because your hand is more suited towards big pots. And stuff that you've not hit yet is just the same as stuff that you've already hit. By the end of the hand, whether the 4 was on the flop, the turn, or the river, it will still contribute to your straight if a 7 comes down here and you have 5-6, for example, or you have 6-7 and a 5 comes down, same thing. I'd like you to try and think about stuff you haven't hit yet, having outs as part of your equity and therefore part of your value portion of your raise in the betting sink, not part of your bluff. It has nothing to do with the notion of bluffing that you have equity. In fact, it makes it less of a bluff the more equity you have. It makes it more of a value bet. So it's not really right to think about really high equity draws as bluffs. Anyway, I digress. The point here is that there's a large value region. I've put the green tap here to the right of hands like Queen Jack suited to illustrate that things like these double Broadway, backdoor flush draw, backdoor straight draw hands with decent pair draws and overcards to your hybrids, they're going to be calling a lot. And for that reason, when you raise with something like 8-6 of hearts, it's actually in part a value raise. In fact, value is the principal reason for this raise, because being the good poker students that you are, you'll remember that denial is not a sufficient reason for raising. Value is the primary tap, denial is the secondary one. That said, denial is one of the factors we still have to consider, and here it's possibly at its most influential. There are very few spots in No Limit Hold'em cash games where you can get this much denial from such a wide region. This staircase of hands that you see on the left here next to the orange tap is extremely combinatorially large. You're not seeing this to scale, remember. The box of King 10 offsuit is the same size as the box of 8-6 suited, but King 10 offsuit is 3 times more combos than 8-6 suited. If you could see this to scale, you'd really start to appreciate how big an effect offsuit cards have on ranges. And the reason denial is so huge here is that there are so many of these hands in Button's range. That said, when I say denial is huge, I mean it's huge for denial. Its impact is about as big as it can be. It still doesn't mean that objectively, compared to the value tap or bluffing tap, that these hands are raising just for denial, or that denial is more of a reason than value here. It's not. Value is the main reason for which you raise 8-6. You have a lot of equity. Your hand likes big pots quite often because of its outs. There's a lot going on here. Raising the flop is not a simple thing, and there's a lot more to it than a lot of people first think. It's not just about building a really polarized range and raising obvious draws and top pair, good kicker plus. That's a very bad strategy. Very exploitable one long term. So how do we adapt this if we're facing a more polarized action now? Let's say a b75. As we can see, there's less raising. The one thing that changes in particular when we face a bigger c-bet here is that we don't make as many thin value raises. If you look at a hand like pocket eights here, which is a hand that would have raised very often against a small bet, it's barely raising at all. And while that doesn't mean that raising is bad, it does mean that it's not as incentivized, strategically speaking. As we can see here, the bottom of the value range has, I guess you could say, it's shifted downward. The reason I've changed the texture here is that villain wouldn't really be using a bigger bet on the last texture we looked at theoretically, but they would on this one. We've talked about the reasons for this in lecture 9. The idea here is that ace-7 is just about good enough to raise via the combination of being quite a vulnerable pair that's going to gain a lot, being low on the board from denial, because there will be more of these double big card combos out there in villain's range that are folding, and usefully so. And also this is about where we have a value threshold. The value is separated into two different elements, partially just getting called by unpaired hands and things that we're ahead of, maybe a worse 7, and then secondly, being able to redraw against overpairs and hit trips or ace-7 and win a very big pot. Lower EV bluffs this time are going to be things like gut shots. These are going to be pretty close to the worst things we can raise, but we can also raise some of these two big card backdoor flush draw, backdoor straight draw hands, perhaps something like 10-9, as you can see here, 10-8. Well, these are immediate straight draws, sorry, but something like Jack-10, Jack-9. Mostly in hearts, but I think in clubs would be beginning to push it now. It might be okay. Certainly raising Jack-10 of diamonds here would be very bad. When villain polarizes by betting bigger on the flop, their range will be very different and will be in a less favorable world than if they just bet all of their range small. So we have to be more careful with bluff selection. Then we have some of these merged draw raises. These are actually not going to be considered bluffs. Having the Jack-4 of hearts or Jack-5 of hearts here is mostly those that are raising. Like I said, clubs might be like on the periphery, but it will mainly just be the hearts that are raising here on the right hand side of your screen where you see the suited cards. I think it's a bit weird to think about these as bluffs. We'll talk about that in a second. And then we have the classic hybrid. Again, note that the 7x that chooses to raise here, the 6x that chooses to raise here, and even the deuce x that chooses to raise here are going to have lower kickers. Again, making them more vulnerable and making that fold equity more useful. So raising makes the pot much larger on average than it could have been. If we see calling as a bx, where x is equal to villain's original bet size, then raising is a b4x, a very large bet size indeed. Consider choosing to bet 4 times as big as you could have. That's akin to choosing a giant bet over a tiny one. Therefore, it's polarization that guides raising and not range advantage. When we face a polar b75, Clark's theorem suggests that we should use less bigger sizes because villain's range is more polar, or in other words, choose call more often instead of raise. We can therefore extend Clark's theorem to form the following rule. Raise theorem. The more polarized villain's range, the less frequently we should raise. We can also extend that to look at the inverse. The more condensed villain's range, the more often we should raise, or the more merged. Maybe merged is the better word because they won't be capped. And as we saw when they range bet the flop, we're going to be raising a lot more. Pay attention to villains that actually try to range bet a board like this, because then you actually have quite a favorable board for your range on which they've adopted an absurd strategy. Then you really need to go crazy in order to make them lose EV by doing that. At the low and micro stakes and at live 1-2-2-5 games across the world, people bet all of their range on random flops, and their opponents just let them away with it, because they've not studied how to react. Let's come back to these draw raises. I want to work on how you guys think about draws, and by draws I mean high EV draws. Not like some flimsy pair draw with a backdoor, but something like a flush draw or an open-end straight draw. The absolute pinnacle of the drawing world. So when we see the starting equity of our flush draw raises, it becomes clear that referring to them as bluffs is not quite right. If these hands miss on the turn, they will move a bit closer to that label, and then I don't actually mind the label semi-bluff. I think when you've missed the turn and you have about 20% equity, semi-bluff is a pretty good descriptor actually. I don't think so on the flop, where there are still so many elements at play. Here are the flush draws and open-end straight draws. We can see them in yellow here, like the Queen 8, the Jack 5, the Queen 5. We see other hands here too. This is just the raising range overall against b75 on this board, remember. But the flush draws come in at around 50 to 53% equity, that sort of thing. This is quite value-y, right? When you have a hand that starts off with 52 or 53% equity, a lot of that is value. A bunch of the time, the turn or river card will be a heart, and when that happens, your hand is absolutely massive thick value with implied odds to boot. So I think the value tap is running here at quite a fast flow and filling the betting sink up, or raising sink in this case, up tremendously. Remember, these hands are not 50% plus equity when called, but they have a very strong EV conversion. And what that means is that when your value raise gets called, I'm going to call it a value raise in part for now, you're going to still have a lot of EV in the pot. You might be somewhere close to half of the pot in EV, even though your equity is a bit lower. That's because if you miss, you're not likely to lose loads. But if you hit, you have a lot of implied odds. The implied odds are positive, and the reverse implied odds are not that much. And bluffing. There's definitely useful fold equity here, but is it really useful enough to call it a bluff? Normally, when we think about bluffing, we actually consider causing an opponent to fold a hand that's dramatically better than ours, or entitled to far more of the pot from ours. Villain will never fold the nut flush draw here, so will not be folding a hand that's entitled to far more of the pot than our hand, no matter what they have. Therefore, the usual fold equity with bluffing here is going to be constrained to folding out hands that are just a bit behind, maybe slightly microscopically ahead, something like that. You will not be getting someone to fold a hand that's doing really well here. When it comes to bluffing, you need to understand this label doesn't really apply properly to these hands, not in the sense in which we've introduced bluffing in the character poker skills thus far. And then denial. The fold equity we get when we make someone fold while we have a flush draw, they're folding 45% equity, 42% equity, 51% equity, something like this. It's actually too good to just be classed as classic denial. Normally, denial is just folding someone off of about 20% equity, but these hands actually get someone off of about 50% equity. So if bluff is too strong a word and denial is too weak a word for how useful this fold equity is, perhaps we have to meet in the middle. Yes, there's some value here, but the other element with which we raise for here, I'm going to refer to as extreme denial. We're basically denying villain a lot of equity, but not quite bluffing them. What's villain's response when we raise here? Let's imagine that we have King 4 of hearts, and we decide to raise this time. We could have called as well, that would have been fine also. What does this raise do to the strength of our raising range? Does this make our range stronger, or does it make it weaker? And how should villain respond if we add a lot of these hands into our raising range? This is the default response. A little bit of 3-betting here because the fold equity from villain's point of view is now more useful. Though I should stress that many humans will simplify to just never 3-betting here and just always playing call or fold against your raise, which is probably not too bad of a simplification. But the fact is that the hand we're raising here with King 4 just has a lot of the pot in entitlement. 50% of it to be precise, even after we face this big bet, throwing us down into a less favourable world for our range. So if this hand is entitled to 50% of the pot, it's already very good. It's extremely hard to have a hand with that much pot entitlement against a big flop bet on a board like this. Therefore, it does not weight our raising range towards bluffs. How can raising a hand with 50% equity make your range more bluff heavy? The only way it can do that is if you're misapplying the word bluff. If you're using bluff to describe any hand that's not a made hand, and that's useless. That's a very bad use of the word bluff, because then you're no longer distinguishing between hands like King 4 of hearts and hands like 10-8 offsuit. Both are bluffs in that sense, doesn't make sense. So this hand, or its addition I should say, to our range, neither makes our range stronger nor weaker. It just keeps our range whatever it was before. What I see people doing all the time in private coaching is being very keen to raise whenever they have a draw, like a flush draw or 8-9 or 5-4 here, but never raising with a hand like 10-8 because they have better bluffs. When you do this, you actually make your raising range really strong, because adding tons of King 4 of hearts to your range barely waters it down because these hands are so good. They're basically control hands, they're medium equity. So what you need to do is add some lower EV ones if you want your opponent to be indifferent. The semi-bluffs are bluffs fallacy is at the heart of what people get wrong about raising flop. I remember reading Super System on a bus many years ago, before I was really even playing online poker. Probably was just playing like a home game. I picked up a copy of Super System and I remember reading a bit where Doyle Brunson talks about how he's the guy at the table that might have a flush draw when he raises the flop, and everyone fears him because of that. And I found this very interesting at the time. Oh wow, he's crazy. You know, Doyle's wild, he's going to raise with a flush draw. He doesn't even have a hand yet and he's going to raise. And you get this very old school view that you just play ABC and you just value bet your good hands. It's not even ABC, it's just wrong. But you get this old school view sometimes, and a lot of that still exists today. So even though people today would probably admit that, well, Super System was a great book for its era, it's very behind the times in terms of poker theory. And while most people would not want to confess to being this fellow depicted in the photograph here, the drawing, I should say, who is basically just thinking it's wild to raise with a flush draw, a lot of their strategy actually reflects these beliefs. When you filter through their databases and you look for low EV bluffs, you just don't find them. Instead, you find every flush draw being raised and every set and two pair being raised. If you raise me on the flop and I know that's your range, of course your opponents don't always know that's what you're doing, but the ones you have more sample on that are using their brains will figure it out. Then I can just fold everything. I just don't ever have to feel indifferent with any part of my range. Remember, I was supposed to be incentivized to call Queen Jack suited on Ace 8-4 with just a backdoor flush draw to your raise. If you're doing it properly. If you're not, I just fold that hand. And what that means is that you're not making me indifferent. You're reducing the EV of my hands below 0. That doesn't help. You don't get any points for making someone's EV negative because you can't. In game theory, I just fold whenever my EV becomes negative. That means that you're overpaying against the rest of your opponent's range. You might think, well, what's the downside if I make it losing for you to continue all of your hands? All of your bluff catches, all of your mediocre hands, all of your backdoor draws plus pair draw. What's bad about that if I make it losing? What's bad is that you haven't gained anything by making it losing, because I'll just fold and my EV will be 0, so you may as well have just made it indifferent. And what you've lost is more EV when I have the top of my range. So when I have a set or something, you've just made it too big for those purposes. And you've raised a range that's not recouping anything because I don't actually have to worry about it. When I don't have a hand, I don't have to continue. When you have a value hand, you don't get paid. Lots of bad things happen. Once upon a time, raising with a high equity draw was considered an audacious and aggressive play. But as we've seen today, these hands don't do much to water down the equity of our raising range whenever that range contains a decent amount of value hands. If you truly want villain to be indifferent and you truly want to build a tricky strategy that's hard to play against and keeps you protected from counter exploitation, then this is what you have to do. What we really need to do if we want to play in an unexploitable way is to raise flop bets with a mixture of 3 types of hand. Value hands, and these can be thick or thin, and these will make bluff catching much worse for our opponent. If we only use these, villain would have no decision whenever they had a bluff catcher. They would have a very clear fold, and we wouldn't be gaining anything. We wouldn't be getting paid off by worse, and we'd just be increasing the amount of money we lose when we're behind. So this would be very bad in the long term with a high visibility game where you can be counter exploited. Merged draw hands, these have little effect on the EV of calling bluff catchers for our opponent. So when we raise here with a hand like a flush draw or open end straight draw, we don't really make it that much worse for villain to continue, nor do we make it much better. So if we only have these 2 types of hand, then to a slightly lesser extent than previously where we just have value hands, we're still making it bad for them to ever bluff catch. We're never being paid off in a full visibility game, and we're overpaying against our opponent's strong hands by raising, and just losing whenever we run into good stuff. So what we need to do is add in this third crucial piece to the puzzle, the low equity bluff. By adding this in, we make calling bluff catchers better, and that's what we want to do. Because after we've used the first 2 types of hand, it's minus EV for villain to call a bluff catcher. So in order to bring that EV back up to 0, which is crucial to do to ensure that in the long term you get paid whenever you have a value hand sometimes, then you have to bring that back up by using these hands. When you have a set, you deserve to make a lot of money. So don't put yourself in a situation long term against observant opponents where they know they don't have to call you with a pair of 7s on Ace 8-4 or a pair of 7s on 7-6-3, whatever it may be. Don't make them feel like they can just fold all of these marginal hands correctly. You're basically just going to destroy your EV. Of course, in anonymous pools, low visibility games where no one knows what you're doing, which is rare. Most games people have some idea what you're doing, especially in live poker. In those games you can get away with this, but it's still pointless and it's still a very bad habit. And if you only raise value hands and draws, and the population has this leak, because let's say you play 10NL on an anonymous site and the better players in that game have the read that the pool doesn't raise enough low equity bluffs, which is 100% correct, and you just happen to be behaving like the rest of the pool, you'll be exploited by that player that's playing against the herd. He's like the lion and you're one antelope in the herd. What about this spot then, the turn? How do we go about raising the turn? It's not something we do a lot of. Why would this be? pause the video, have a think about this question. Why do we have a very low raise frequency here? You might think it's obvious, but I'd like you to articulate it in words, write something down if you can. The answer is that we've already condensed our range. We saw the immediacy with which we had to raise sets and 2-pair on the flop against high frequency betting on our opponent's behalf. We don't really have very many value hands left. That said, on the 4 turn, we have just turned some hands. We can have pocket 4s, and that's definitely a hand that we would like to raise with. It's also a fallacy to say that just because you have hardly any hands that you should be raising, that you raise no hands. Pocket 4s needs to raise here, or at least it does if your opponent's not so aggressive on the river. Therefore, I think it's good to build a raising range on the turn. I wouldn't typically simplify to just call in this spot, but we do want to do it sparingly. We have to remember we don't have a lot of raising slots left in our range here. Clark's theorem says we're really condensed, villain is really polarized, therefore we don't do a lot of big sizing, and raising is a big sizing, remember. Another way to explain this is that we've already raised a lot of our best hands. Sets in particular are normally going to be pure raises because they have this favourable combination of unblockers, massive equity, and the urgency from facing a bet out of position. Remembering that our urgency is higher out of position when facing a bet, but higher in position when facing a check. And so this is the raising range. As we can see, the value region is squarely built around 4-4. This is the only hand that is now tempting to raise with. Even King 4 doesn't really cut it because King 4 is going to block a lot of villain's bet calls. At this point in the hand, it's actually not great to block a king when you're raising, because when you block a king here, you're going to be blocking a ton of bet calls, but these hands won't always bet the river, so it's not the case that you get money from them either way. As we see, pocket 4s is the crux of our raising range here for value, and then we build around that with some flush draws mainly. We have to have very high standards here. We can't just waltz into this spot with some backdoor draw like Queen 9 of Hearts that missed and raise, because then we'd be raising a trashy tier 7 hand with negative blockers in a world that's bad for our range. That would be a totally abominable raise. So it's just 4.33% raise here going on, and as we can see, the raising range revolves around the newly made tier 1 hands. Had villain blasted the flop for 75% pot or overbet the flop, that need not be the case. And maybe we could build a raising range around hands that we slow played on the previous street. But we don't have a lot of flop slow plays against a small flop bet that we'll commonly face on King 7 Deuce. And our bluffs here should be chosen mainly on very high rolls, meaning that we have a flush draw and we rolled high. Or maybe we just have the kind of flush draw that has to raise here. There are certain ones that raise more than others. Queen high ones, for example, because they can't call like the more robust ace high cousins can, but they're a bit too good to fold like the little sibling of Jack 6 or Jack 5 would have to fold here. When you rationalize certain draws that are in that Goldilocks zone where they're too frail to call but also too good to fold, then those hands raise. There might be a lot of those depending on the texture, or there might not be, but don't be afraid to fold certain flush draws here as well. When you face B75, your EV will be really close between calling and folding with most draws. What about the more polarizing turn cards for the big blinds range? What about a 10 of hearts turn? Do we raise a lot more on this card, given that we've just made a lot of nutted hands? While our range does uncap a bit here, relative to villain's landing range on the turn, that's villain's range, remember, before they bet, many of our best merge draws will have raised the flop. A lot of our draws have already raised, so we don't have that many flushes, but also, and more importantly, bear in mind that when villain bets the turn here, on a 3 flush card, which is generally going to be decent for the pre-flop caller, villain does not barrel their entire landing range in this spot. Rather, they're going to polarize heavily. So we're not going to be in a very good world, and we're going to be against a very polarized range, and we're still going to have a much more merged range than our opponent will, even though we have repolarized a bit here, meaning that we became more capped on the flop by not raising. We raise a 3 a lot, but then on the turn we're repolarized by this card. We're repolarized relative to our own range, but compared to our opponent's range, we're still quite depolarized. Because while we have a lot of Jack X and flushes, villain actually has boats here way more often and many more nut flushes given that we didn't raise flop. Therefore, all of this considered, we still don't get to do much raising. In fact, we do even less here against a properly constructed opponent. If you think your opponent's too merged here and just bets Jack Queen or King Jack or Jack 9 all the time, then absolutely you can start raising more. But in general, you don't want to do a lot of raising here because relative polarization doesn't change. Relatively speaking, villain is still much more polarized than you. Therefore, there's almost no raising at all. That's right, even when you have the nut flush here, you don't have to raise. And this hits upon a very familiar pattern from earlier in the course. Flushes just simply are, due to their blocker properties, bad at getting value. They are hands that, while they look very good and visually they're quite striking, they struggle to get called, more so than other hands, because they block continues. For example, when villain has the ace of hearts in his hand here, they'll always be continuing every single time. What will villain's bet folds be? Thin value bets like pocket queens with no heart, or ace jack with no heart, or possibly just a naked bluff like 9-7 with no heart, or some other gutter or other bluff. Overall, when you have two hearts in your hand here, not only is it quite far from being nutted to have a king high flush or queen high flush here not even strong enough to raise anyway, you have to really consider relative hand strength here, but even when you have the nut flush and you have a hand that's good enough to raise, you still shouldn't very often, because your hand is only indifferent between calling and raising with a nut flush here, and this is based on how polarized the opponent is and having bad blockers for raising, and these things will counterbalance the high equity of your hand and make it optional to raise. And then when you have an optional raise, this is the final part of the puzzle, because your range desires very little raising here, you should usually call with that optional raise. When it's 0 EV difference between calling and raising, you want to consult your range and say, range, are you doing a lot of raising here in general? Or is it like 3%? Because if it's 3% or even 2.25% as we see here, no hand should really raise. In fact, you could just simplify the call only here, meaning call is the only means of defense against any opponent who's properly constructed. Of course, if they're merging and betting every overpair because they're afraid of the fourth heart or some logic like that you'll find from a lot of players in a low-level game, then you'll want to raise a lot, but that's different. That's not theoretical. Against good players, you shouldn't do much raising. So note that there are no tier 1 hands in our range which have good blockers for value raising like the 4s did on the previous slide. In fact, the only tier 1 hands in our range here are nut flushes and they have bad blockers. We don't really have quads because we raised that on the flop. We don't have jacks, we don't have 10s because we wouldn't have just called with that pre-flop, and we don't have jack 3 or 10-3 because we would have folded that pre-flop. There is basically no way of having a hand that's good enough to raise here unless it has bad blockers. That's what's going on. Relative polarization that matters. Always think about how polarized your range is compared to that of your opponent, and don't just make blind, absolute claims like my range is polar I raise. That's a very bad habit I see from a lot of students. Finally, what happens on the river? Let's start by looking at facing river blocks, because we want to raise these much more frequently than other river sizes, and it's much more useful to study spots that come up a lot. Big blind button again, 3-3 deuce rainbow, check, range bet, and call. This range bet is a classic example of one that a solver won't make by human will. So the strategy that you want to deploy against this is probably one that you should lock in a solver to make button bet every single time, rather than looking at some pre-made sim where button's only betting 70% of their range. Check, check on the turn, and we reach this classic favourable river probe opportunity for big blind. Big blind will of course have a mandatory bluff with all combos that have missed here due to the favourable action sequence of calling a bet and then seeing the in-position player check behind. How would you play the following hands as the button? Would you raise, call, fold, or mix 2 or more of these options? Pause the video, have a look at each of these hands, write something down if you can, and this should make a nice warm-up exercise before we get our teeth into the exam at the end of this class. I'll assume that you've done that and that you've unpaused. As ranges have been left incredibly wide here, bearing in mind that button's flop bet did not contract their range in any way, but the turn check did considerably weaken it, we're going to be much further up on such a still lake, as we say in grade 1, such an innocuous run out here than you would think. That means that a hand like pocket sixes is actually very strong. Another thing we should note before we go any further is that the big blind player should actually be building multiple sizes in such a spot. What that means is that the times that the big blind has actually got here with a 3 that they slow played, or a boat that they turned or rivered, or a straight that they rivered, they're going to use a bigger sizing pretty often, or maybe throw in a sneaky check raise. This B33 will be largely made up of hands like deuce X and ace high for value. That's right, big blind can value bet hands like ace jack here. That means that pocket sixes and button shoes is a mandatory raise. Really important to see this hand as very strong. Bear in mind the river could have been anything, but it was a fairly innocuous 5. Your pair of sixes is just way bigger than what you're expected to commonly show up with on this node. So when you have a hand that's unusually strong for your overall range and has high equity against your opponent's range, you need to be betting for value, or in this case raising for value. Ace 10 is a call. This is a value beater because it can chop with other ace high, or maybe even beat some ace high that villain is thin value betting. This hand is not quite good enough to raise, but this hand is so far away from a fold that it's not even funny. If you check back the turn here as button after range betting this flop and face this action from a competent player, you're winning more than half the time here. You have huge equity, not enough to raise, but slam dunk call. Queen Jack of clubs, this is a hand that you cannot really call with. This is not quite a bluff catcher, I don't think, or maybe it's close to one, but it's a very bad one. You're blocking some bluffs here like Queen High Jack High. And another problem with this hand is that it's just very bad for raising. Some air hands can be raised even though they can't be called. That's not totally uncommon, especially in a spot like this where any pair is too good to bluff and you're not bluff raising pairs, so you can't use blockers that are on the board here. There will be some hands that are raising, but it will be absolutely not Queen Jack, and this again just comes down to pre-flop hand selection. People have a lot of Jack X and Queen X. They call a low flop with a lot of it, especially with two clubs, not having the dead suit here of diamonds. And then they bet the river as a bluff with Jack 9, with Queen 8, with Queen 10, with Jack 10, with all of these hands. So this is one that you should absolutely fold because you just have too much in the way of blockers to villain's bluffing range. Finally, the 8-6 of spades is the opposite. By unblocking the big, abundant Broadway cards that may be offsuit in big blind's range or may not be, maybe they're backdoor flush draws, but you unblock all of them. And it's also very nice here to have the 6, because the 6 is a card that villain will be very often raising on the flop with, and will therefore not get to this river with when they have a bad hand. Not many of villain's bet folding range here, not many combos in that range contain 6. The 8 and the 6 are much more favourable cards for bluffing than the Queen and the Jack, but they're unblockers, and so we go ahead and raise this hand. What have we learned? What are our heuristics from this exercise? So firstly, we need to remember that B33 is a very capped range in GTO in a spot like this, so it's easy to have enough equity to value raise versus it, even with marginal looking made hands. But they're not actually that marginal when you think about it. Secondly, we saw that we do not want to fold ace-x in this node because this is actually a value beater. That's right, our opponent can be value betting as thinly as ace-6 here because our range is so weak after range betting and then checking back on a board that's really hard to hit. We just don't have pairs and things like that very frequently, and we have to call a lot of king high on the river here as a bluff catcher. This is going to be really key to take note of, that when you're in these wide range late position battles, the board is low and dry like this, you need to be upgrading the strength of all of your hands in the bluff catching system. Hands that look like bluff catchers become value beaters, hands that look like frail hands become bluff catchers. And thirdly, we want to bluff raise with cards low enough unblock villain's folding range. Always think about where your opponent's bad hands are the most dense in their range. And when your cards don't interfere with that, that's the time to bluff in these worlds where you have to be selective. Not Queen Jack, but 8-6. That is the end of grade 2. So after revising this course, and I would recommend doing that before you take the exam, open up the PDF file called Grade 2 Exam that you got in your folder, and you will then find it useful to watch the feedback video after you've taken the exam. To take the exam, I would recommend using a solver. It's okay to do that. We don't have any problem with you doing that because the exam is going to ask you why. It's not going to ask you to come up with an answer. It's going to ask you to explain an answer, to explain a hand's behavior or a range's strategy in equilibrium. So you can solve hands if you want. Just bear in mind that I'm interested in why. I'm not interested in what. When you've completed the exam and got your feedback from the video and maybe filled some of the gaps in your knowledge that were illuminated by doing that process, it's time to move on to grade 3. You can find grade 3 on carrotcorner.com if you haven't got it already, and maybe if you purchase the full scholarship, then you're already good to go with that course. Also, don't forget to check out carrotcorner.com for more instructional poker courses from me. I'll see you back here for the exam feedback and then on grade 3. Until then, good luck at the tables. Hope you found this course useful, and I'll see you soon. Bye for now, guys.